and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for coming, and thank you for the invitation. Like Craig said, this is really a personal narrative, so you'll get to know a little bit about my life and how I ended up here. So I'm gonna read this script. I'll advance the slides in places. I thought it was really important to have at least a few shots of places that informed my life, because not all of you have been to the places that that I have been. I thought this particular quote was really really telling of how I thought about my journey, both intellectually as well as pedantically, and sort of moving across the country. And so, the talk is somewhat informed by these two concepts: the concept of serendipity, of finding delightful things that happen along the way, things that you hadn't thought about, things that you didn't think were intended. And this concept of bricolage is basically taking the things that you find and building something from them. So I think these, in some ways, define my life. This little map sort of shows how I've jaunted around the continent and across the world. So starting out in Nova Scotia, moving to Winnipeg, to California, back to Winnipeg, then to Minneapolis, then to Maine, back to California, and then to Hawaii. So those are just the moves. Certainly lots of other traveling in between. So this is New Glasgow, the town that I grew up in. So I was born during a snowstorm in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia, on Canada's east coast in 1956. New Glasgow was the central town in Pictou County's coal mining country. The county was predominantly of Scottish and English heritage, with a smattering of French, and a small Black population who came with the British Loyalists during the War of Independence, or were smuggled into Canada after coming north on the Underground Railroad. The town was dominated by a river, the East River, which runs through the middle. The Presbyterian churches, there were 3 of them within 2 blocks of each other, and the one clothing store, Goodman's. The local grocery store, Sobeys, from the neighboring town of Stellarton, would later become a national chain and one of Canada's largest corporations, the Empire Corporation. By the time I arrived on the scene in 1956, the coal mining was waning, and the pulp and paper industry was coming into its own. I grew up with one older sister and 2 parents, Evelyn and Clem, a small but compact family. We were in many ways the outlier. My father was the oldest of 12, my mother the second oldest of 11. My first cousins ran to 60 in number. There could have been more because both of my parents had siblings who never married or had children. As the oldest son growing up during the Depression, my father left school after 6th grade to go to work on one of the local farms to help support the growing number of siblings. At the age of 20, he answered Canada's call to arms and joined the Canadian Army, going to England in 1943 on the Queen Mary, and then to the continent a month after D-Day. An artillery gunner, his unit fought in all the major battles of the liberation of Holland. Even though the army was not in my future, I think my dad was disappointed in that. His experience in the war made Europe, especially the UK, Belgium, and Holland, places that seemed real to me. Returning from the war, my father went to Ontario to work in the steel mills. He returned after a couple years. His oldest brother stayed. My mother left school after 8th grade to go to work to help support her family. Like many Nova Scotians, she went to Ontario, along with several of her sisters, to work. She did return home. 2 of her other sisters did not. While the war was still on, and found work in one of the munitions factories, putting on shell cases on the large artillery shells used by the army. She used to bang the shells to get this casing on, and her colleagues thought she was going to blow up the factory. Her experience of going away to work, even for a while, colored my perception of growing up. Leaving family to go elsewhere to go to work or school was what people did. Very common in Nova Scotia. People often said of Nova Scotia exported 2 things: fish and brains. My parents had the opportunity to migrate to New Zealand in 1954, but my mother wouldn't go. Too far on a ship. School and the academic year cycle has been part of my life as long as I can remember. My sister started school 2 years before I did, and she came home and taught me everything she learned. At that point, we shared a room. I must have been a quick study because I did kindergarten and first grade in 1 year and was only 1 year behind her. I liked school and I liked to read. My mother, however, didn't read to me very often. She had dyslexia, and reading for her was very hard. Though she did take me to the local public library, and I regularly brought home stacks of books. Every Sunday afternoon involved a drive in the country, sometimes randomly or perhaps to my grandparents' farm, which was about 8 miles away. These car trips developed my love of being in the car. In 1966, we embarked on a cross-country camping trip covering most of the Canadian provinces and quite a few US states. It turned out to be the first of many cross-continental trips that my father and then I made. During junior high, and high school, I spent much of the summers working on my uncle's farm, picking beans and tomatoes and hoeing corn for the grand wage of 33 cents an hour. Many of my cousins were also cheap labor on the farm, and our free time was spent at the beach playing softball or making homemade pizzas. Working on the farm made me not want to be a farmer, not a surprise, but also gave me an appreciation of what it takes to grow things and to make a living doing so. Summers during college were spent working at a paper mill, a horrid but well-paying job, and certainly a motivator to finish university and do a different type of work. I graduated from high school in 1974, packed bag and baggage, and headed off to Winnipeg, Manitoba, to attend the University of Manitoba, following my sister. For those, sorry, ignoring my slides here. So schools I went to. Here's Winnipeg. For those of you who don't know anything about Winnipeg, Winnipeg's about 75 miles north of the Minnesota-North Dakota border. One of the flattest and coldest places on earth. Literally any rise in the terrain of more than a foot or so is man-made. The area is so flat that it's difficult to see Winnipeg from any distance away because it drops below the horizon. You have to be about 10 miles outside of the city before you could actually see that the city exists. Winnipeg was my first big city to live in. So New Glasgow was a really tiny town, about 12,000 people at the time when I was a kid. It's now down to about 9,000. Winnipeg at the time in the mid-70s was about 400,000. My first experience with an art gallery, a symphony, a planetarium, and it was in Winnipeg that I learned to drive. I set out to study history, a favorite from high school, but an absolutely awful history professor and a brilliant and engaging British New Testament scholar caused one of the first changes in my academic trajectory. Religious studies became my major, and history became a minor. Going to university more than 2,000 miles from home allows you to grow up, or perhaps forces you. I was only 17 at the time. Being a first-generation student, I had to navigate all the complexities of the university, student loans, housing, etc. on my own. This was long before cell phones. And with long-distance charges of more than $3 a minute, even a phone call home for some parental sympathy was pretty rare. I actually talked to my parents usually once a semester. On a cold January night in 1977, it was approximately 35 below, so that was not an uncommon temperature in Winnipeg at that time. A friend began showing pictures of San Diego and Point Loma Nazarene University, where he had gone to college. The original plans of staying in Winnipeg and doing a teaching credential went down the drain almost immediately. An escape to exotic California was an option. This was another of those serendipitous moments that changed the course of my life. In fall '77, I headed up to San Diego, driving from Nova Scotia to San Diego via Winnipeg in an old Chevy Vega, a car my dad said he wouldn't drive to New Brunswick, the neighboring province that was 100 miles away. And of course, he told my mother that when they were 3,000 miles away on vacation. She probably would have tried to prevent me from going, but the 4,100 mile road trip lasted a couple of weeks and included Mount Rushmore and Yellowstone, just for the heck of it. Arrived in California to attend Point Loma, intending to spend a year, taking whatever courses I wanted to. I was paying for it, so I figured I could do what I wanted, predominantly in religious studies. After an enjoyable first quarter, so they were on a quarter system, I applied to the master's program and had to spend an additional year enjoying an unprecedented, at least to me, view of the ocean. So there's San Diego, and there's the Point Loma campus with a unobstructed view of the ocean. Being an international student, I could only work on campus, and I knew only one person on campus, one of the librarians, whom I begged for a job and got one. The next 2 years of working 20 hours a week in the library provided many learning opportunities that shaped my future, though I certainly didn't know it at the time. I had no intention at that point to be a librarian. After graduation, I returned to Winnipeg to work, and of course, go to school. I was a bit of a perpetual student. I enrolled in a graduate program in philosophy and religion and landed a job at the University Library. And so if we go back University Library is in the upper right corner, the Default Library. During that time, I applied to a PhD program at the University of Toronto and didn't get accepted. That was another sort of turning point. One of my mentors, a longtime school librarian, kept pushing me towards library school and even offered some financial assistance. After a couple of years, I finally acquiesced and ended up at the University of Western Ontario in London, Ontario, which is about 2 hours west of Toronto. A year after graduating from Western, I returned to California and took a job at Point Loma Nazarene as a reference librarian, thus beginning my second stint in California. In 1991, I married Gail Schwab. We had been students at Point Loma during the late 70s. And when people ask me, how did we meet? I always say, I don't know. At university, we knew who each other was, and we had sort of an overlapping circle of friends, but I never actually remember being introduced to her. Also in 1991, I started a PhD program in library science at UCLA, driving the 127 miles each way 2 days a week. While gas wasn't as pricey as it is today, traffic was just as bad. The first 70 miles of the trip took 60 minutes. The last 57 took 2 hours. Our twin girls were born in 1992. They were 7 weeks early, and needless to say, there was no real sleep for the next year because they did not sleep through the night until they were a year old. The PhD program was abandoned. Just an impossibility to work full time and manage all of that. Sensing a need for the twins to be close to at least one set of grandparents, we moved to Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is where my wife was from, to be close to my wife's parents. A year and a half later, again, so did some of these unexpected events. My father-in-law died of cancer. 20 days later, my son Jake was born. My mother-in-law was diagnosed with breast cancer and Alzheimer's. None of the things that we were expecting, but life hands you things that you don't expect. I worked at several libraries in St. Paul and Western Wisconsin, ending up at Macalester College in middle management. During that time, I went back to school, what a surprise, and started an EDD program in higher education leadership at Nova Southeastern University. One of the things that I never expected to learn was house renovation. So, hence the house on the left-hand side. My dad, who could build almost anything, thought I was pretty useless when it came to building things. Shortly after we moved to Minnesota, we bought this little story-and-a-half house built in 1939. It needed major work, and eventually we gutted the house down to the studs and started over. With a few books and some videos, this was 10 years before YouTube, I taught myself everything from wiring to drywall to window installation. Over a period of 10 months, we finished most of the house. The little house we bought for $68,000, we sold 3 years later for $145,000. And when I was looking for this picture, I see it's currently listed for $301,000. So I guess I did something right in the renovations. I vowed I would never go into library management. I had said this loudly and to many librarian friends and colleagues. A leadership class in the EDD program began to change my thinking. And when I saw the job ad for the director of libraries at Colby College, I threw my hat in the ring, so to speak. Colby was a long way from Minnesota, but close to Nova Scotia, where my parents lived. We knew my mother-in-law, who no longer knew anyone because of the Alzheimer's, would soon be gone. And my mother was failing as well. And we wanted our children to be close to the one remaining grandparent, my dad. Moving to Maine from Minnesota is not a trivial task, but not one that would be considered unusual. People move across the country all the time. For us, it was pretty traumatic. Moving meant selling my wife's family home, leaving her mother in a nursing home, trekking 2,000 miles east, driving a U-Haul, pulling one vehicle and driving a second. We were to close on selling the Minnesota house the night before leaving for Maine. And to our surprise, a superstorm blew through the Twin Cities, depositing 8 inches of rain in a few hours, and seemingly much of it in our basement. This meant renegotiating the price during closing and delaying leaving towns by about 8 hours. Not the best way to start the journey. Arriving in Maine, we unpacked, headed to Nova Scotia to see my mother one last time, as she was on her deathbed due to cancer. Too many stressors in 1 year, not to be recommended. I spent 14 years as a director of libraries at Colby College, an upper tier liberal arts college. Colby was small, wealthy, privileged, and at the time, 95% white. Now, almost 19 years later, it's about 39% students of color, which is a pretty notable feat in terms of their recruitment, because Maine is the second whitest state in the nation at 95.4%. I was hired by a provost that had the best philosophy: hire good people, get out of the way, let them do their job. During my 14 years, I had many opportunities to experiment and the money to do so. We got to try new technologies and services, and I had money to send librarians and staff to conferences fully paid. They brought back ideas that we implemented. Private colleges don't have many of the rules and regulations of the public university system, and we were able to experiment and make quick decisions. During that time, I got to participate in helping Colby Basin Bowdoin colleges, so those are the 3 big privates, or 3 little privates, in Maine, build a collaborative single collection. I established and hosted Maine Academic Libraries Day, a day-long professional conference, and wrote a successful $800,000 IMLS grant to help academic libraries in Maine develop a long-term print retention strategy, a program that influenced the work of HathiTrust in its own long-term print retention strategy. Probably one of the things I was most proud of was building a library facility and completing a $9 million renovation behind here. So it was in the town of Waterville and Colby, and that big white house, old Victorian, was our house. So this is Colby Library and the result of the renovation. So as you can see, the library is sort of modeled after Independence Hall. In the 80s, they built an ultra-modern box on the back, and they destroyed almost all the historic interior of the original building. I don't know why they did that, but that's what they did. So part of my goal was to try to restore the glory of the original building. So the 2 pictures on the top right are the reading room. When I got there, that was tech services. So it was all office space, all cubicles. And I wanted to bring it back to something that resembled a reading room in a real library. So I think that was pretty successful. We also built a storage facility that would hold 500,000 books. Of course, life is never so simple that it should not get complicated by events, other people, or even by your own doing. Following the massive tsunami that hit Southeast Asia in December 2004, with so many children left without parents, my wife and I once again thought about adopting. Prior to getting married, we had talked about it, but too many other families' issues intervened over the years. Soon became apparent that the children left parentless in Thailand and Sri Lanka wouldn't be eligible for adoption anytime soon. We turned to an international adoption agency that worked in South America. We soon identified a sibling group of 4 that needed a home. Despite our age, I was 49, my wife was 48. The paperwork and the approvals went quickly, only 6 months. And And in October of 2005, we flew to Medellin, Colombia, to meet 4 children who had been in foster care for 4.5 years. At a small Catholic orphanage where they had been for 3 months, we met Wilson, Danilo, Mauricio, and Maria. 4 tiny, sorry, I'll get emotional with this. 4 tiny, malnourished, yet beautiful children. Wilson, the oldest, at 14, weighed 75 pounds. And Maria at 6, weighed 26. They spoke no English, and we only a few words of Spanish. After 27 days eating wonderful Colombian food, seeing some of Medellin, including Pablo Escobar's neighborhood, he was gone by that point, a court hearing and an embassy visit, we headed home. The children had seldom been in a car, let alone an airplane. We teased him that the airplane was a taxi with wings, because they had been in a taxi several times with us while we were there. We landed first in Miami, where upon touchdown, they were officially U.S. citizens. A second flight to Boston, and then a trip to Maine with a stop at the flagship, LL Bean store to buy winter jackets. They had never experienced cold weather, saw snow, or so many people who didn't look like them. They began the adventure of American schools 2 days later, and despite the language coped much better than I expected. I had been especially worried about Wilson, the oldest, at 14, because language seems to be harder after 12. But he was a real novelty, and all the junior high girls really loved him, and he wanted to be able to talk. He learned exceptionally quickly. I wish I could say that overall school was a good experience, but it wasn't for most of them. The amount of prejudice was more than I expected, and from a different source. It was mainly from teachers and administrators. It was not from fellow students. I can't say any of this was easy. Prior to the adoption, through their 4.5 years of foster care, they had been moved every 6 months. At 6 months until about 18 months, they tested us in any and every way that they could. They needed to know that they were with us for good. The teenage years, I'll say, were also challenging because we had 6 teenagers at once. That's not for the faint of heart. After 14 years, it was time to move on. Waterville had slowly become a welfare town, and I was increasingly misenamored with Colby's privilege. Also, my new boss was a challenge. After many job interviews across the country, I landed the job as the Dean of the Library at Cal State Fullerton in Orange County, just north of Anaheim, and the happiest place on earth, Disneyland. After a 6-day cross-country trip in late March with 2 of the kids, we landed in Fullerton and a small apartment. My wife was coming when school let out in June with the others, except for our oldest, who at that time was working in Indiana. In spring 2017, before leaving Maine, my wife was diagnosed with fatty liver disease. And by early October of 2017, she was in the hospital needing a liver transplant. Little did we know that she wouldn't come home until almost the end of February. 150 days home. Working full-time at a new job and in the evening driving 100 miles round trip to UCLA Medical Center in LA traffic became the new normal. Fortunately, my daughter Rachel, a recent library school grad from the University of Western Ontario, same place that I went to school, put her job search on hold to help manage things. And she was my frequent driver and companion and sometimes chauffeur on the way to UCLA. After all this driving back between Orange County and UCLA, my daughter can drive anywhere. I mean, if you can manage that kind of traffic, you can do most things. Meanwhile, the work at Cal State Fullerton was seeming to go well. We were in the midst of a partial renovation. We were hiring some new staff. Despite some budget challenges, things appeared to be heading in the right direction. Very shortly after he had left the hospital, I was asked to come to the provost's office, where I was shown the door and escorted from campus. There was no warning, No indication that there were any questions about my work or any unhappiness with it. The library staff was devastated, and there was certainly some uproar amongst the student body. What followed was probably one of the most difficult and soul-searching periods of my life. 22 months of being unemployed. Not only was I worried about providing for my family and keeping a roof over my head, but my self-worth really took a beating. Endeavoring to keep professionally active, I revived a previous blog that I had started and posted usually every second week. Kept active in ALA and ACRL, wrote and published an article in Library Leadership and Management and 3 book reviews in the Journal of Privacy and Intellectual Freedom. And with more than enough free time on my hands, I read about 350 books, including about 30 on Hawaii. There were too many job applications, Zoom interviews, in-person interviews, and too many times I heard no. Each time I had to pick up myself up, start a new application, do the process over again, knowing that in some cases the interview was only a courtesy and that the internal candidate was going to get the job. And I was basically told that on 2 occasions. During that time, I developed an interesting friendship with Beverly and Ernie Toy, both librarians who were in their early 90s. Ernie had been the founding university librarian at Cal State Fullerton, and Bev an AUL at UC Irvine. They still lived on their own, still drove, were intellectually and politically engaged. During this difficult period, they became adopted grandparents, or perhaps really adopted parents. All of their children from previous marriages were my age and older. During this period, they celebrated their 50th anniversary. Pretty good for a second marriage. At 95 and 96, respectively, they're still going strong. And I'm certainly looking forward to seeing them over the holidays. I interviewed at UH Mānoa in early September 2019. And after 11 weeks of silence and my own internal resignation that the job was going to someone else, I got a call from Michelle Tom saying that that Provost Bruno wanted to talk to me. I sat in my car on a side street alone, knowing that I would need some time alone if the answer was no. He offered me the job. So that was November the 12th. With an anticipated start date, January 7th, I had 6 weeks to find an apartment, pack, and move. I was coming alone with Gail to follow sometime in 2020. And she did end up moving to Hawaii in late September. I arrived on island by myself in late 2019, and the first public event, so to speak, was watching the New Year's Eve fireworks from Waikiki Beach. It's hard to go back to those first days at UH because COVID time is muddled and both shortened and lengthened time. I spent much of the first weeks getting to know staff and trying to understand the library and the university. 10 weeks in, COVID shut everything down, and I felt I was trying to lead an invisible organization. Imagine in some ways it felt like what pilots feel when they first encounter blinding fog. Which way's up? And where am I going? While I have followed university presses and libraries in terms of mergers or even collaborative partners, I never expected the press to be part of my life or role. In early December, when Joel Kosovo, the then interim director of the press, told me he was leaving and that the provost wanted to talk to me, I knew life was going to change again. The press, like the library, has its own language, workflows, and mission. It's been interesting and engaging to get to know this other side of the scholarly process and see how books come to be and are set out into the world to make a difference, even a small one in how we understand the world. So here are a few things that don't fit nearly into the narrative, but I think are integral to part of who I am. As a kid, I wanted to be an architect, but I discovered when I took drafting in 9th grade, I couldn't draw a straight line with a ruler. That is not objective. I cannot draw. Games like Pictionary are of the devil. Despite my lack of architectural skills, I have an abiding interest in architecture and have had the privilege of looking at libraries from an architectural perspective all over North America, Australia, New Zealand, and in Europe. And I've even helped with a few projects. Sorry, I've been advancing, Pollock Library, Fullerton here. I love to bake. My mother, who had very traditional ideas on gender roles, didn't want me in the kitchen. So after university, I lived alone for 13 years. And with the help of my trusty Betty Crocker cookbook, I learned to bake. My staff can attest to what I learned. I love to drive. The thought of wide open road and a road trip, short or long, makes me happy. I've driven the 5,000 long Trans-Canada Highway from St. John's, Newfoundland to Victoria, British Columbia. I've driven back and forth across the US numerous times, sometimes in an unair-conditioned black car. Not fun. At least not when you got to Arizona. Other times with family in a bit more comfortable setting. One of the things I really find challenging about Hawaii is the lack of driving options. Despite that, we circumnavigate the island at least once a weekend. So driving for me is an important part of my life. I'm a reader, fiction and nonfiction. I typically do most of my reading via audiobook, and you will often find me on the bus, in the car, walking across campus, or on the beach with headphones. A couple of books per week is pretty normal for me. I love to travel, domestically and internationally. All 10 Canadian provinces, 49 states, Delaware being the exception, and 18 countries, excluding US and Canada. The countries are in Central and South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, and Oceania. Road trips in other countries are a good thing too. There's so much to learn from traveling the world. However, the bucket list of places to still visit is very long. So to wrap things up, one of the privileges of being a librarian, I think, is being allowed to be interested in everything. Unlike most professions, which of necessity are very focused and narrow, the scope of a librarian's work can encompass the world at large. Life is not a map or a blueprint. Very few things I've done were things I could have imagined as a child or a young man. I publicly vowed I wouldn't do many things and ended up doing exactly those things. I never expected to leave Canada or to end up in the center of the Pacific Ocean. I've been in the US since 1986 and in Hawaii since 2020, so we'll see how that worked out. All along the way, there were serendipitous opportunities and an opportunity to assemble a life of the pieces at hand. Life is the journey, we make it.
Thank you.